Good. Well, thank you again for having me. It's always a joy to be here with you in Flemington. What I want us to do this morning is pick up on a theme that we have explored together the last few times I've been here for Sunday school, and that's this theme of divine incomprehensibility. And what I'll do, I have this problem sometimes in my classes, especially when I teach the same course to different students on different days of the week. I forget exactly where I left off the time before, even though I intend to pick up there. So what I will do is I'll briefly sort of refresh ourselves on what we're saying when we say that God is incomprehensible. Again, look at some of the texts that I know we have spent some time on and explored, not in the same depth as we have, but just to refresh ourselves. And then what I wanted to, and this I'm sure we haven't pressed into as much, is to explore a somewhat difficult aspect of theology, and it's the question of, if God is incomprehensible, how is it that we speak of Him and know Him? Because the Bible not only says we do not know Him, it also says He prays that we would know Him. Is the knowing Him sort of a resolution to the not knowing, or do we know and not know at the same time? What are we to make of this? How is divine incomprehensibility not a problem to be overcome, but rather, as we've been saying in previous sessions, a mystery to be adored? Again, I'll take as sort of prelude to opening up the Scriptures the expression in the first half of chapter 2, section 1 of the Second London Confession. If you want to see that, it's in the back of your hymnal, page 671. Let me again just read the first half of Article 1 at the bottom of page 671. And then we'll look into the Word a little bit as well. The Lord our God is but one only living and true God, whose subsistence is in and of Himself, infinite in being and perfection. And then here comes the first reference again to incomprehensibility, whose essence cannot be comprehended by any but Himself. So when we say incomprehensible, we don't mean that God is a pure, unintelligible nothing. He is incomprehensible to all except to Himself. I take this to be what Psalm 147 speaks of when it says that God's knowledge is without limit or is infinite, that God Himself is the proper object of His own self-knowing. God is not a mystery to God. He is a mystery to us, a mystery we adore, but He is not a mystery to Himself. The Spirit of God, as Paul says, searches the deep things of God. So, not comprehended by any, but by Himself. Going on, a most pure spirit, invisible, without body, parts, or passions. Let me just pause for a second. This invisibility and this bodiliness, partlessness, and passionlessness, I take it all contributes to the incomprehensibility, meaning this, while it's something we confess and we would even say we know, it places God beyond the ordinary ways of knowing things. Okay, we'll come back to it later. Who only hath immortality, dwelling, and here's the second affirmation of incomprehensibility, dwelling in the light which no man can approach unto. This is, again, that incomprehensibility in which God is hidden from us in a strange imagery. He's hidden by light. He's hidden by the sheer brilliance and excellency of His being. It's not some vacuousness or lack of being that hides God away from us. It is the sheer brilliance and excellency of that being which no created intellect can actually, as it were, encompass. In other words, as we've said, His greatness and His brilliance always exceeds our greatest thoughts and perceptions of Him. Again, this shouldn't lead us to despair, but it should lead us to say, Lord, be praised above all praising. Be blessed above all blessing. Again, we don't delude ourselves thinking that in our praises we have somehow done adequate justice to the greatness of God. Our praises are but a little spark of a greatness of light and brilliance that we could never actually express. There's a beyondness in all of this inapproachable light which no man has pressed into or can, as Paul says in 1 Timothy 6. Moving on. Who only hath him dwelling in the light which no man can approach unto, who is immutable, immense, eternal, and then here the word just comes in, incomprehensible, almighty, every way infinite. I also take it that contributes to the incomprehensibility, in as much as my mind is not infinite in its act of knowing. It could never actually sort of encompass that which is in every way infinite. Most holy, most wise, most free, most absolute. So, multiple times in this first half of the first section in the chapter on God and the Holy Trinity, our confession reminds us repeatedly of the incomprehensibility of God. In fact, the repetition of this is remarkable. There are a number of wonderful attributes that are listed for us there in this, but 3 times this incomprehensibility keeps sort of cropping up in one way or another in our confession. I take it that our forefathers wanted us not to be slack about this fact of incomprehensibility. They're from different angles. They keep putting it in front of us, wanting us to think about it. What then does Scripture say? Well, I think we are all familiar with texts that talk about the knowledge of the Lord. And I don't mean that to slough them off. They're important. They're precious to us. But we also need to reckon with these texts that mention His incomprehensibility, that there is, again, as I say, this beyondness with regard to God's being. Again, a few texts from Job. We've commented at them at length earlier, so I just mentioned them now in passing. Job 11, verse 7, Zophar rebukes Job, and he says, "Can you discover the depths of God? Can you discover the limits of the Almighty? High as the heaven, they're as high as the heavens, what can you do? Deeper than Sheol, what can you know? Its measure is longer than the earth and broader than the sea." The point is, can you discover the limits of the Almighty? The answer is no. Again, not because you lack the instruments necessary, but because there aren't any limits to be measured. There aren't any limits to grasp. In fact, he compares it to earth. He says its measure is longer than the earth and broader than the sea. The point, brought in a kind of metaphorical imagery, but the point is God's greatness, the so-called limits of the Almighty, simply exceed infinitely the created order. So you can think about the created order. You can think about the vastness of our world and the many things that there are to know. And the point is that these things do not, in a certain sense, hold God in. It's not that theoretically, if you could search out all the available truths around you in the natural order, you would finally figure out God. You think of the Russian cosmonaut who comes back with the report, having left our atmosphere and gone into space, coming back with the report that he went up to space and didn't see God there. As if God's godness were going to just sort of be confined somewhere or other. As if the being of God does not simply exceed beyond limit the very vastness of the world itself. A little later in the book of Job, Zophar challenges Job twice and Elihu, the young man, challenges Job twice with this incomprehensibility of God. First in 36:26, he says, "Behold, God is exalted, and we do not know." Now, the NASB supplies him, because that seems to be the proper object. What the idea is, we do not know his exaltation. We do not know him in the sheer exceedingness of his exalted way of being. And then he goes on, "The number of his years is unsearchable." The point, it's just, again, picking up a sort of temporal imagery as metaphor and saying he's not the sort of thing that we can fit onto timelines and calculate and say, and here he begins and here he ends. The reason we cannot calculate the beginning and the end of God, again, is not from the fact that we don't presently have the instruments necessary. It's that there's no beginning and end to measure. There's nothing that can be metricated about God. God cannot be placed into a kind of system of analysis that picks out the limits of things. I take it that that's what all measure and metrication is. You stick a yardstick against the wall or measuring tape, and you watch how your children grow, or you measure things by your watch. Time and space are containers, in a sense, in which we place things that are measured by those measures. Time and space are ways of measuring extension and duration. Okay? And so measuring the years of God would work if God's life were metricated. That is to say, had bits, as it were, that could be sort of cobbled together, added up, and you could say God is such and such old, and that sort of thing. And he says his years, the numbers of his years is unsearchable. Again, the point isn't because you don't know how to count high enough, but because he exists beyond all counting. counting is a numeric measuring of a thing. He just exists, he exists in a way that's beyond that. So again, back to his first point. God is exalted, and we do not know him. Now, you're not supposed to despair about this. You're supposed to wonder at it. I don't mean the wonder of frustration, the wonder of standing in the presence of the one whose greatness is simply and infinitely extended beyond you, beyond any perception you might be able to adequately have of it. You're staring into, when we consider God in this respect, we're staring into an abyss, not of darkness, but of sheer light and excellence and greatness. It's not the abyss of despair, it's the abyss of exhaustless and endless wonder and perfection and greatness. And so he says, we do not know. Again, that's okay. Job 37 then, Elihu continues toward the end of that chapter, verses 22 and 23. He says, the Almighty, we cannot find him. He is exalted in power, and he will not do violence to justice and abundant righteousness. Therefore men fear him. He does not regard any who are wise of heart. That is to say, he does not regard those who think that they understand it all. But again, I love how it sets it up. He says, now men do not see the light which is bright in the skies, but the wind has passed and cleared them. Out of the north comes golden splendor. Around God is awesome majesty. And then he says, the Almighty, we cannot find him. Why? Not because he is hidden away somewhere out of sight, but because he stands before us as shrouded in the light of awesome majesty, so much so that we could not actually comprehend it. If I can use an analogy, it's similar to trying to, through your senses, perceive pure white light. You just can't see it. You can confess it. You know that it is there, but it's not something that you can sort of measure by sight. You need some kind of refraction of the light into color in order to sort of set it off. You need some shadow. You need some diminishment of it just to be able to sort of get at light. There has to be some kind of limit placed on the light so that you can sort of perceive it. The same is true of God, if I can say it this way, and I'm trying to be very careful, and I'm going to step us into this whole challenge of thinking of God and speaking of God. There's a sense in which God also refracts his glory, as it were, into a kind of perceptible variety, so to speak, a perceptible way of approaching him that does not necessarily mean that he exists in that way, but he makes himself known in a way that we can, as it were, bit by bit approach him. But to actually perceive his sheer and infinite majesty, the awesome majesty that is around him, the Almighty, we cannot find him. His exaltation is beyond our finding out. We can add, in addition to that, a number of other texts. Psalm 145:3, God's greatness is unfathomable, as I mentioned before in our studies. The fathoming is the idea of dropping a measuring line into water. You measure the fathoms of water, the depth of water, by dropping in a measuring line. And when that measuring line hits bottom, you pull it in, measure the string, and you will have fathomed the depth below you. You will have measured its fathoms. God is unfathomable, again, not simply because we lack the string or the line necessary, but because there's no bottom for the line to hit. There's no final deep thing about God. When it says the Spirit searches the deep things of God, it's not that the Spirit gets to the bottom of God, it's that the Spirit infinitely knows the bottomless glory of God. Can I say it like that? Again, God is not just great in the sense of there's just simply quantitatively more to him than other great things. Rather, his greatness is an unfathomable greatness. It's not the sort of thing that has a limit to it. Psalm 147:5, God's understanding is infinite, or innumerable is technically what it says. That is to say, God doesn't know a lot of things in the sense that a scientist might have a vast store of facts, so to speak. Rather, God knows without limit. God knows without boundary. It's not that the boundary is way out there like it is for, Einstein or Newton or something. It's that there's no boundary out there. It's that and again, if I can just say this, the only proper object of an infinite act of knowledge is an infinite being, which I take to be the knowledge of himself. This infinite knowing of God, Psalm 147:5, is really this perfect knowledge of himself as the infinite one. A couple other texts we looked at briefly. Isaiah 40 we looked at as well, which says, I won't turn there because we have to get into some other things, but it says in effect that God puts the measure on creation. He sets the boundaries for the water and for the mountains, and he measures the mountains like fine dust in a pair of scales, or what the islands are. In other words, in creation, God is what puts the limit on creation. Creation is not what puts the limit on God. God is not limited or hemmed in or held or contained by his creation. Rather, his greatness and being exceeds creation itself. Perhaps the most spectacular statement in this connection is in the Confession of Solomon in is it 1 Kings chapter 8? Solomon addressing the people. 1 Kings chapter 8. Verse 27, at the dedication of the Solomonic Temple, again, the most glorious building ever seen by those present that day. Again, probably rivaled in terms of structures only by the pyramids, which, of course, by this time were old and already in a state of dilapidation. So they're looking at, arguably, what is the most remarkable man-made structure that eyes were ever laid on, and yet there's this moment of sort of stark realism where Solomon sort of pauses in the middle of this prayer of dedicating a house to the Lord, a Bethel, really, and he says, "But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, the heaven and literally the heaven of heavens cannot contain you." And that's the key to incomprehensibility, containment. And that's when our forefathers said that he cannot be comprehended. The idea is that he cannot be, as it were, contained or encircled by, circumscribed, hemmed in by that which is made. I've shared this with you before, but it bears sort of reminding ourselves of this statement of the medievals that the finite cannot contain the infinite. The finite cannot contain the infinite. That which is made does not hem in the Creator. God is not held in by what he makes, no matter what the vastness of it, and no matter what the brightest display of glory. And I think that's what Solomon's getting at here. He's saying, will God indeed dwell on the earth? Indeed, the heaven of heavens, which in Hebrew thought is arguably this very throne room of God's resplendent glory. This is that place where Isaiah witnesses the seraphs crying, "Holy, holy, holy," night and day, as they fly around this throne room that is full of God's glory from Isaiah chapter 6. What Solomon is saying is, even that most resplendent display of your glory, which is not on earth, but is arguably in the very throne room of God's manifested presence in heaven, even God's manifested presence in heaven does not contain him, does not exhaust him, does not put a limit on it. The glory of the heavenly throne room is not it. All it is the highest manifestation in creaturely form of it. So it makes it, when I say it, I mean the glory of God, the glory of his being. So that, again, we have to remind ourselves, heaven is created. Those seraphs are creatures. That manifested realm of glory in which those seraphs and the souls of those made perfect and the 24 elders and all the other remarkable group that we see in the book of Revelation, all of these are creatures living in a created order. Heaven is not the uncreated place. Heaven itself is but the highest realm of God's creation in which he most remarkably and without parallel displays his glory in a way unlike anywhere else in the created order. But the point of Solomon is, even in that most exalted throne room of displayed glory, the heaven of heavens, the heaven beyond the beyond, does not contain him. We'll talk about this a little bit in the sermon, actually. The psalmist says that God stoops, makes himself low to behold the things of the heavens. That in order to, as it were, give attention to heaven, God is condescending even to behold the most glorious of all creation. God makes himself low God makes himself low in order to be present to the Most High. Does that make sense in terms of creation? So he says, the heaven of heavens cannot contain you, circumscribe you. God isn't held in. It's not like, he's beyond the earth, but he's definitely like all there in heaven. He's not all there anywhere. The being of God exceeds here and there, if I can say it like that. That there's no sort of proximity that puts the coordinates on God and says, that's all right here. Okay? So then he goes on, how much less this house which I have built. Now here's the covenantal beauty of this text is that God does condescend to manifest his glory among us here on earth. And he does condescend to manifest his glory even more remarkably in heaven. But let us not mistake the condescended manifestation of glory for the thing that is being revealed. What is being revealed, the glory, is not captured, measured, metricated by the most glorious display of it. God does not in other words, it would take an infinite manifestation of glory to adequately measure him, and that which is created, which is this realm of manifestation, simply cannot contain boundless glory because everything created is necessarily bounded. It contains, it holds in, and God is not held in by it. A few other texts you know well. His ways are not our ways, his thoughts are not our thoughts, exalted above the earth, Isaiah 55. Romans 11:33 says that his judgments are unsearchable and his ways are unfathomable. Again, cannot be sounded out. 1 Timothy 6:16, God dwells in an unapproachable light. No one has seen him or can see him. Again, even heaven itself is a condescended form of glory. And so this is why the priests, when they come to dedicate that temple after the return from exile in Nehemiah, say, pray that God would be blessed above all blessing. They're ascribing a blessedness above the highest expression, human, creaturely expression of blessedness. A few other texts, Jeremiah 10, 6-7, reminds us that no one is like the Lord. In fact, you get this repeatedly in the Isaiah 40s. How many times does God say, who is like me? Who is like me? Continually, he keeps putting this out there. Jeremiah chapter 10, verses 6 and 7, something along these same lines. He says, there is none like you, O Yahweh. You are great, and great is your name. Who would not fear you, O King of the nations? Indeed, it is your due. Who among all wise men of the nations and all their kingdoms? There is none like you. God is peerless. God isn't like, fill in the blank. God isn't like, some things are like God. We are created in his image. There are things that, in a small and finite way, echo and reflect his glory. But in terms of actual likeness, there is no parallel or peer to God. He is beyond all of that. All right. That being said, I think we've got our biblical texts down. At least a few of them. What I want to say, though, and what I want to get into is a proper sense of what we mean by comprehension. We talked about this briefly, I think, but I want to elaborate on it and then try to illustrate it somewhat, if I might. When we say that God is incomprehensible, we need to sort of define our terms in a strict sense. To prehend a thing is to, and I think we went over this, but again, we just have to remind ourselves, to prehend a thing is to grab hold of it. Okay, so I have this little clip that I used for my papers. And if I were to prehend it, which is what I'm doing now, I would be grabbing hold of the thing. And I really am in contact, as it were, with the thing. But in prehending it, or we might say, in apprehending, a police officer runs down someone and he lands a flying tackle, and we say that he apprehended the suspect. Okay? This prehending of things, this grabbing hold of things, is not the same as comprehending the thing. To prehend is to grasp or lay hold of, but to comprehend, if you put that little prefix in front of prehendere, but to comprehendere is not to grasp, it is rather to contain. To contain by encircling. That's you can actually hear that little, the comprehendere, you can hear your little root from compass, the idea of getting around a thing. To comprehend is to entirely enclose a thing, to encircle it. The officer may apprehend the suspect, but until he has him locked down in the cell, impenetrable on all sides, he has not really comprehended him. It's actually a term from physics that we borrow in epistemology, which is the idea of knowledge. It's technically a statement about grasping. And we use this phrase, I don't grasp what you're saying. But what is grasping? Grasping is a getting hold of things. You're using this term metaphorically. Its proper sense is actually the sense of grabbing hold. To prehend or comprehend, we think comprehend is a statement about knowledge mainly, and that to use it in physics is analogical. It's actually the other way around. Its proper use is with regard to physically apprehending or comprehending, and then we metaphorically borrow it to refer to the activity of our mind as either grasping a thing or comprehending a thing. We might say, I can't get my mind around that. Okay, that would be comprehension, to get your mind around a thing. The point with incomprehensibility is this. It's not, do we know him? Or, do we know him, then we comprehend him, or if we don't comprehend him, then we don't know him. I want to suggest that knowing is to prehendere what comprehending is to comprehendere. So the idea is this. It's not that we do not know him, it's that in our knowing him, we have not, as it were, captured him. That what we know is not untrue, but nevertheless, at the same moment, we do not, as it were, fully contain in our minds the fullness of what we know. It's not that we don't know, it's that we do not comprehend what we do know. Does that make sense? Just like this. I can prehend it, but I cannot comprehend it. You can know him, but you cannot comprehend him. The senses are distinct. So that being said, what we don't mean by incomprehensibility is merely that there is a sort of a merely quantitative distinction. So it's not like this, that to the extent I know God, I comprehend him, and that beyond everything about God, beyond what I presently know, is what I don't comprehend. I think we can all accept that there's a sense in which we would agree there's much about God and his greatness and fullness of glory that we simply don't know. Not only that we don't comprehend, that we don't know. The point, though, is not that we comprehend him to the extent that we know him. It's not a question merely of, okay, he's infinite in being and our knowledge extends this far, and so to this extent we comprehend, and incomprehensibility, if I can put it that way, incomprehensibility refers to all the stuff on the other side of our knowing. What I want to say, rather, is that incomprehensibility does not kick in where your knowledge ends. Rather, incomprehensibility refers to the entire thing, both to your knowing and what you don't know. So that in your knowing him, you are not to just that extent comprehending him. Again, I go to maybe the best single text bringing this out. There are a few, but maybe Psalm 139, where David, in the first 5 verses, rehearses those things about God knowing him perfectly and holding him in, but placing his hand over him, above him. And he says, and then beyond that, he says, such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too high I cannot attain to it. So the question is, does he know what he's talking about, or in other words, does he know what he's talking about? The answer is, I guess so, because for 5 verses he's been telling us wonderful things about God's knowledge. And then he says, such knowledge, and I take it in context that he means the knowledge that I've just spent 5 verses describing to you, is too wonderful for me, too high, I cannot attain it. I think this gets at the point here. There's an unattainedness even in the knowing. There's a beyondness, even so we can say God is good, wise, loving, true, just, kind, and eternal. And I'm just grabbing some words that come to mind, but we could say much more than that. We can say all these things about God. In knowing those things, good, wise, loving, just, kind, eternal, omnipotent, all that other stuff we say about God that we know about God, do we comprehend what we know? Do we comprehend his omnipotence? Do we comprehend, that is to say, in a full and exhaustive way, his love or his wisdom, his knowledge? If we comprehended the knowledge of God, necessarily we would have to be infinite knowers. We would have to exceed our own being as finite creatures. We would have to be God. Let's rule that out. In other words, all of these things that you and I say we know are not on this side of incomprehensibility. Rather, incomprehensibility applies both to the known and the unknown. Again, so incomprehensibility is not merely a statement about quantitatively what we do or don't know. In fact, most properly speaking, the sense of incomprehensibility is probably better understood as qualitative. That is to say that in all of our knowing, there is, if I can put it this way, a dimension of being and excellence that simply transcends our ability to hold in. It's this mysterious way of God's being God that in a certain sense places everything we know in the level of the unattainable. So we know, and yet we don't attain what we know. I take it that David means grab it all in. So what are we supposed to say about this? It's not just the amount of what we know that makes God incomprehensible. It's the manner. It's the way of our knowing and the way of God's being. It's the quality, it's the character of the being of God and the character of human knowledge that makes it such that human knowledge can never be commensurate to divine being. There must always be a lack in the knowledge the creature has of God. Again, this is why we say, be blessed beyond all blessing, praised above all praising, because we never expect that our praises are going to actually sort of top out, hit the limit. Because there isn't a limit. So we can praise and praise and praise unceasingly, and we will never find that our praise has sort of finally reached the level of adequacy. When I say inadequate here, I don't mean sinful, I mean finite. We're talking about creatures not as fallen, but creatures just as creatures. Adam and Eve, apart from the fall, and if there never had been a fall, would be in this exact same situation. This is not a consequence of sin. It's a necessary implication of creatureliness. And it's a necessary implication of divinity as not creaturely. So what are we to make of this different manner of being, this qualitative incomprehensibility as opposed to just merely quantitative? Henri Blachet talks about what he describes God's radical transcendence as the absolute non-symmetry between the Creator and everything that comes to be. I like that way of putting it, the absolute non-symmetry. It doesn't mean that we know nothing of God. It means that our knowledge of God does not capture Him in a one-to-one way, or if you want a mathematical term, in an isomorphic way, so that we don't map out the very contours of divine being in our mind so that we can actually have, as it were, an image of it. I also take it that this is behind the command not to make images of God, the idea is that the finite is never going to actually capture the excellence of God, and we end up having these degraded thoughts of God to the extent we think that they can. So therefore, I think that the prohibition of the images is actually also built on this reality of incomprehensibility. That being said, non-symmetry, as Blachet puts it, does not mean utter and total dissimilarity. This is the key, because we have to still say there is a knowing of God. I think, again, of Jesus' high priestly prayer in John 17, verse 3. He says, "This is eternal life, that they may know you." So I take it that whatever incomprehensibility means, it can't be that there's nothing known to us. It's not that we are just mystics with no notion whatsoever of what it is we worship. We say many things about God, and we believe that in saying these things, this is part of our knowing Him. So how is it, and I'm really pressing into sort of the knotty, Knotty, knotty question of what it is for creatures to know the non-creature, what it is for the finite, which by definition and necessity could not contain the infinite, what it is for the finite to know the infinite if this knowledge is not a containing. And if this knowledge, in a certain sense, cannot in a one-to-one way map out God in our heads, in our thinking. Our thoughts are not adequate measures, dimensionally speaking, of that truth. In a book by Stephen Boyer and Christopher Hall called The Mystery of God, they write this with regard to the mystery of God's godness, so to speak. The parallel is not with extensive mystery, again, just that there's more to know than you currently know. We all agree on that. The parallel is not with extensive mystery, but with, they say, dimensional mystery. That unclassifiable superabundance that places the Creator beyond creaturely categories of intelligibility altogether. But they hasten to add this. This does not mean that God is unintelligible like a logical contradiction, but it does mean that God is, in some sense, supra-intelligible, that He is outside the boundaries of what would otherwise count for intelligibility. That there's this beyondness to God that simply defies classification. So what are we to make of this? Thomas Aquinas, and I'm not going to go long on the Aquinas quote. He's a medieval theologian, philosopher, who spent a great deal of time thinking about this whole matter of why it is that creatures cannot have a knowledge that, as it were, measures up to God. And he was quite right, and our Reformed forebears, Presbyterians, Baptists, were all in agreement with Aquinas on this. If you want to read John Owen agreeing with Aquinas, it's all there. So I'm not just trying to go for a medieval Catholic, but there was a sense in which even our Protestant forebears understood that he was on to something important in this regard. He says this with regard to knowledge: the knowledge of any knower takes place according to the mode of its own nature. Okay, let me unpack that briefly. That means that you cannot have thoughts that transcend what you are. You can have thoughts of that. You can have thoughts of one who transcends what you are, but your way of thinking of the one who transcends what you are cannot transcend what you are. Are we good on the difference on that? In other words, so put it this way: you can know the infinite, but you cannot know the infinite infinitely. Good? You can know the Creator, but you cannot know the Creator you cannot know the Creator in a creator-like way. You can only know the Creator in a creature-like way. And that's what Aquinas is getting at, that in the mode of knowing, the manner of our knowing cannot transcend the manner of our being. And if our being is finite and creaturely, then necessarily we will never have anything but finite and creaturely thoughts about the infinite one who is not a creature. So, what are we to make of this then? How do we speak of him at all? Because we do. We pray to him. We entrust ourselves to him. We read of him and his word. We write up confessions saying lots of things about him. How is it that we come to say all these things we say about the one who is always beyond anything we say, right? And the answer to this question in brief, and I'll try to illustrate it, is that we speak of God because God condescends to speak to us. We speak of, and how does he do this? We'll get into that. I will not be able to answer that question, but I can at least sort of, in an illustrative way, try to come at it. When God speaks to us, he does not speak to us with a kind of special heaven language. By the way, God doesn't need language. I think I've said this before. Language is a system of linguistic symbols or sounds meant to mediate knowledge to those that don't have it. Ergo, God does not need language. God does not need a symbolic system of sounds to convey knowledge outside of him. Rather, God's knowledge is actually internally infinite and actual. So language as a mediatorial system of signs, sounds, or written doesn't matter for God. But we do. We do need both language and imagery, if I can go with the Romans 1:20 idea as well and put that all in here, that God makes himself known to us not by, as it were, giving us a capacity adequate to the measure of his being, because that would be to give us the unmeasurable knowledge, transcending our own creatureliness, which we never do. Even in glory, you will just be a creature. That's okay. Jesus didn't come to save us from being creatures. He came to save us from being sinners. Okay? Creatureliness is okay. This is fine. In fact, creatureliness and the reminding ourselves that we never transcend it is what allows us to remember that God is God and we are not. So this is fine, but there's the question of how God makes himself known, and he makes himself known in actually many ways through the propositional language of Scripture, whether you hear that sounds or whether you see it, symbols on a page, whether it's in Greek or translated into English or Hebrew or Aramaic, it doesn't matter. You could translate this same word into many different languages or unique symbolic systems, okay, signs and sounds. You could translate it, and God stoops and condescends to use this mediatorial system of language. Moreover, he condescends to use the mediatorial system of images. Not that he makes an image of himself, but rather he presents images before us of created things, stars and clouds and grains of sand and ducks and humans. Okay? And in all of these things that are created, he makes himself known to us, right? This is what Romans 1:20 says. It says that that the invisible attributes of God and his eternal power and divine nature are clearly seen, not in and of themselves, okay, but are clearly seen in the things that are made. So that under the form of that which is not God, the things that are made, and through the form of that which God does not need, language, through forms that make sense to us, God, as it were, packages the knowledge of himself. Or if I can say it this way, packages the knowledge of himself in a way that we, without comprehending him, can still apprehend him. I use this illustration, and I've borrowed this from Boyer and Hall's book, but it's this illustration of, this was actually some time back, was used in geometry about 100 years ago, and has had different versions since then. But we can talk, and I may have used the illustration before, and let's just bear with it for a moment. The idea of flatland, and this is a thought experiment, so I'm not trying to press every point here into a theological proposition, just as a thought experiment. Flatland is a two-dimensional world in which everything in flatland is bounded by the maker of flatland. In this case, for the sake of the illustration, me with the green pen. I am the one who placed, as it were, the boundaries upon flatland. Okay? I have set its boundaries with this, and I can populate flatland with lots of flatlandish type things, but perhaps chief of them all, I can populate it with the flatlander. I'm doing a little Hebrew there, and I dropped my vowels, but you get what I'm getting at. The flatlander, right. And we could say that our flatlander is a happy flatlander, and here's the thing. We understand and comprehend flatland because we are the ones who place the limits on flatland, because we exceed two-dimensionality. We're not less than two-dimensional, but we are far more than that. And in making this world, as it were, we have placed the limits upon it. We have given it the nature that it has. And in this, we might ask the question, how can we speak with our flatlander? The flatlander, although it looks to you like he's looking out here into the world of three-dimensionality, has no capacity to perceive three-dimensionality. His entire nature and being and world is circumscribed by these characteristics. So how are you going to speak to him of that which exceeds his manner of being? Two-dimensionality. I use this illustration of a cube, perhaps because it's easiest for me to draw. You might say, let me describe a cube to you. Can a flatlander comprehend a cube? No. So you might say, well, it's like, right? And what would you start with? It's like what? Squares. Flatland can have squares. And he can say, oh, so a cube is a square. And you say, no, it's not. No, that's not it. It's like a square, but it's not just one square. It's how many squares? 6 squares, okay. And he would say, okay, I can count to 6. Two-dimensional objects can count up, and we can subtract, and so 6 squares. And then you will say, well, it's 6 squares, and he'll say, how are they arranged? Vertically, horizontally, diagonally. How do you want them arranged? And what you'll say is, well, they're perpendicular to each other, and perpendicularity, of course, makes sense because you can have right angles in flatland. But they're perpendicular in a way that they're not just perpendicular in that two-dimensional sense. They're perpendicular in a way that goes back inside somehow. I don't know how do you say this, right? Three-dimensionality. And he'll say, what do you mean? And you'll say, well, let me illustrate this for you. And you draw this nice illustration for your flatlander, and you would say, now that's a cube. I'm just going to, for the sake of illustration, I'll hurry it up because we're at the end. But you might say, if this were geometry class, being charitable here, would you say that the professor has drawn a cube on the board? Yeah, that would be fair. If the professor drew this on the board at the beginning of geometry class, you would assume that she expected you to understand cube. Is this actually a cube? No. What is it actually? Being very kind. Okay, it's a flat depiction of a cube. It's a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional object for a man who simply cannot exceed his being as two-dimensional. So what have we done? Are we lying to the flatlander? that doesn't seem like the right way to describe this. It doesn't seem that we're lying to him. It seems like we are talking down to him. Maybe that's a way of putting it. We are trying to represent something that cannot be contained by his world in terms available in his world. This is what God is doing when he speaks to us in Scripture. He's not telling us falsehoods. He's not misleading us or lying to us, but he is, as Calvin says so wonderfully in his Institutes, he is babbling and lisping to us as unto babes. It's baby talk. Yeah, even that Aquinas stuff, actually, right? Even the headier theologians. It's all in this respect baby talk. It's us using a finite system of images like light and Shekinah glory, or sounds like a preached word, or symbols like characters on a page. It's us using, it's God using a plethora of finite symbols and sounds and images available to us in our manner of being so that we can come to some truth about him, always understanding that there is a dimensionality of exceeding and unlimited glory that exceeds the medium by which he makes himself known to us. I think when we get to incomprehensibility, this is the key, that all that we understand or know of God is God stooping, as it were, repackaging under the form of creatureliness, whether that is language, written or spoken, whether that is Shekinah glory or a cloud, a pillar, any of that, to make himself known to us again, not with an isomorphic sort of one-to-oneness. We simply cannot comprehend God in a one-to-oneness because he exceeds not just the quantity of what we can or do know, he exceeds the manner of being that characterizes creatureliness, so that the creature can never, as it were, transcend his own self as creature to know in a sort of intuition and comprehensible way the fullness of divine glory. This is what we mean by revelation. This is God not telling us lies, but baby talking to us so that we can apprehend, if not comprehend, some truth about him and love him and admire him for that, all the while standing back saying, I'm sure there's so much more to this than I can possibly get. That's worship. That's not frustration. That's worship. That's the wonder of God. It's the opposite that we repudiate. This idea that we can capture God in our statements or in our thoughts or in our worship, that we have done enough, as it were, that we have given him his due. Let us not think that that's even conceivable for the creature approaching the Creator. All right, let's pray.